The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
When Ontario Liberals converge on Hamilton this weekend for their annual gathering, will they conjure a way to return from the political wilderness they've wandered in for the past two elections? We'll explore that tonight. And amidst swirling allegations of ethics violations at Queen's Park and on Parliament Hill, what power do the watchdogs meant to oversee such matters really have? J.N. Jagannathan looks into that. It's Thursday, March 2nd, and that's straight ahead on the agenda. After more than 15 years governing this province, first under Dalton McGuinty, then Kathleen Wynne, the Ontario Liberal Party was shown the door by voters in 2018. Since then, over two elections, they haven't cracked double digits in the seat count. The party has its annual general meeting this weekend. What do members need to do now to find themselves back on the road to relevance? Joining us now on that, former Deputy Premier and Finance Minister Dwight Duncan, now a senior advisor at the Macmillan Vantage Policy Group. We have two former candidates from the last election tonight. In London, Ontario, Kate Graham, the candidate in London North Centre. She ran for the party leadership, incidentally, in 2020. And here in our studio, Marilyn Raphael, the candidate in Brampton South, who is the incoming president of the Ontario Women's Liberal Commission. And finally, in Naples, Florida, clearly the only smart one among us, Jonathan Scott, who's a town councillor in Bradford, West Gwillimbury. Jonathan headed Michael Coteau's leadership campaign in 2020, ran communications under Premier Wynne, and it's great to have you two here in our studio. I think for the first time, Marilyn, is that right? First time on our program? Good to have you here. Dwight, good to see you again. And our friends in Points Beyond, thank you for joining us as well. Your party did a postmortem after the last election, second straight time coming third. That's unprecedented in Ontario history. And one of the things that it found was what it means to be an Ontario Liberal was not well defined and not well communicated. So let's go around our literal and metaphorical table here and just start with this. What do Ontario Liberals actually stand for today? Kate Graham, start us off.
Sure. Well, I think we need to start with the really big picture lesson from the last election. So one of the clear learnings was that what the big parties are doing isn't working for voters anymore. So the Conservatives lost more than 400,000 votes over the last election. The NDP, it was about 800,000. We stayed about the same, but it was only because we'd lost so many votes previously. It's really only the smaller startup parties that are seeing more people place their trust and their vote in them. So I think the lesson here is about how we do politics. So for Ontario Liberals, to me, we stand for the things that matter in people's lives. We are at our best when we focus on education, on healthcare, on climate change, on the things that people can really feel in terms of their day-to-day quality of life.
Marilyn, you probably, I'm guessing, knocked on 30,000 doors in the last election, maybe more. I want to know what you were hearing at the doors in terms of what people think this party stands for now.
I think when people think about the Ontario Liberals, they're really thinking about the party that cares about them and their families personally. I think they see the Ontario Liberals as a party of balance. We're able to kind of think about putting forward initiatives and programs that care about the common good, the common man, taking into consideration what needs to work for businesses to thrive and families to thrive, and making sure that no one is left behind. I think for me, when I joined the Ontario Liberals, what was really important for me was the belief that we want to create conditions for everybody to prosper, but most importantly, recognizing that some people might need a little bit of a hand up, and recognizing that giving that hand up to some people makes sure that we minimize the gradients of difference among people and make sure that this society actually functions well.
Dwight Duncan, does an Ontario Liberal today, does it mean the same thing as it did when you were Deputy Premier and Finance Minister?
Well, I don't know what the Ontario Liberal Party stands for today. I think we've gone way too far to the left. We need to bring back a laser-like focus to education and healthcare within a broad economic framework that promotes growth and prosperity. I just hear, in my view, a lot of talk And it wasn't until we did that in the early 2000s that we got traction. And I think Liberals need to really get their head around where we sit on the political spectrum. If people want New Democrats, they'll vote NDP. If they want Conservatives, they'll vote Conservative. I think a middle of the road party that's progressive and makes economic sense is where we need to be. So I don't know what the party stands for today, and that's, I think, part of what this leadership's going to be about. Starting with this convention, we have to have a full and frank conversation.
Jonathan Scott, what does it mean to be an Ontario Liberal today?
Well, if you had have asked a staffer in the Dalton McGuinty era, that could have quickly rhymed off practically a mantra that they were hardworking, well-intended people who cared about practical solutions for you and your family. And I think there's still a lot of wisdom in that sort of positioning statement. But I think Mr. Duncan's right. The party has lost its way, and we've lost sight of what the center means in a world where millennials are the largest voting and demographic cohort. We need to define what centrism means as well when we actually have a relatively moderate and relatively popular Conservative premier. I know progressive heads might have exploded, but he's won 2 elections with nearly 2/3 of the seats in the legislature. So what does that mean in 2022 and beyond? I think it has to zero in on the things that people actually care about. Most people don't really care about provincial politics, but they do care about hospitals that work, education that works for their kids, commuting that's a little bit easier, the climate, fiscal and ethical responsibility, and a government that, other than that, largely stays out of their way other than fixing the odd pothole. So I think we have to get back to basics as a party and show that we're focused on people's everyday concerns, as Kate said. And I do think that starts this weekend at the convention, because missing an opportunity to show that the party itself is willing to reform sends the wrong message.
Kate, former Premier David Peterson used to talk about the Liberal Party as occupying the radical middle or the activist center. And clearly a lot of people think the party migrated away from that place on the political spectrum. I mean, you're a poli-sci prof in your real life at Huron University College. What's your view on the advisability of the Ontario Liberal Party trying to find that activist center again?
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, but I mean, I will say this is less as a political scientist and more on someone who stood on, thousands and thousands of doorsteps. For most people, they see us somewhere between the Conservatives and the NDP, and certainly we occupy that middle ground. But I tend to think that most people do not think in terms of a nice, neat ideological line. Instead, they're very focused on whatever matters most to them at that moment in time. Their kid's school, their dad being able to get in and get a hip replacement, protecting their planet for their grandchildren. I think we should focus a lot less on sort of some political landscape and where we strategically position, and a lot more on going back and taking a look at our province. A lot has happened in the last few years. People have very significant needs. So what are the opportunities for us to understand those needs and really champion big ideas that people can see will help them?
If I heard it once, I heard it 100 times in the last Ontario election campaign. People said to me they found the Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party completely indistinguishable from one another on big issues. Did you hear that at the door in Windsor?
Absolutely. And in fact, it was hard, because, we had worked for many years to try to carve out the middle ground. And it wasn't broad philosophical discussions, it was practical policy. So for instance, who was the greatest corporate tax cutter of premiers?
Actually, it was McGuinty, if I
Dalton
recall.
McGuinty. Yeah. We had the lowest corporate tax rates in the country for 2 years because Alberta raised theirs. But at the budget we brought in those corporate tax cuts, we brought in full-day learning. And
this is a party, though, that would not want to brag about the first thing.
Of course, and that's a mistake, in my view. And Ford, in my view, I think the other gentleman said it, he grabbed the middle of the spectrum. I said that here on election night.
Yes, you did. As
we watched these results cascading in. And now we're seeing the real Ford. And progressives, and I think we're all progressives, need to seize that center ground back, because that's where Ontarians are.
Well, let me ask Marilyn, do you think your party, I mean, you were knocking on doors, you were trying to find votes in the last election. Did you in your gut think this party's moved too far to the left for me?
I think I agree with Kate in her assessment that voters do not think about the political spectrum. And I think it's a conversation of ideologies, of pundits and political analysts. But the reality is people care about solutions to their problems. And it depends, and we are really being evaluated on whether we can actually deliver on solutions that solve their real problem. We're coming out of a pandemic. Inflation is high. Home ownership is out of reach. We still have a supply chain that is impacting a variety of industries, and people are finding it, frankly, very hard. And so I think we need to be having conversations and holding Ford and the government to task about whether the solutions they're proposing are solving anybody's problems. And I'll just give you one example. Like, we know that coming out of this pandemic, students had a real challenge with their learning and learning outcomes. And when we see the Conservatives putting forward proposals of giving $200 to each family member that they probably spent, ideally, hopefully on tutoring, as opposed to kind of solving the real problem here of class sizes, of quality of education, making sure that people are getting the gains that they need. And I don't think it's really about positioning social issues and business issues against each other. This is not about pitting the left and the right together, but it's actually seeing that by solving a lot of our social problems, they are economic solutions. And we're seeing that played out with the childcare cuts and the implementation of that. It's having real positive impacts on families. And I think that needs to be centered as
negative impacts on families.
No, positive in terms of like the federal childcare.
Okay. Gotcha.
Right, the cuts to the cost of childcare. That's having huge impacts and implications for families and bringing people to work and bringing women to work. And we need to be talking about solutions that actually solve problems and also help everybody prosper.
I totally get your point, and I'm not trying to turn this into a poli-sci 101 class at Huron University College, Kate. I really am not. Having said that, as people consider their choices, Jonathan, for where they want to mark their ballot in the next election, which admittedly is still a long way away, 3.5 years, they do, I think, without being sort of technocratically political about it, they do a gut check. And they say, where are these parties? Are they for me? Are they too interventionist in my life? Are they not interventionist enough? I mean, they don't necessarily put it in left versus right terms, but they do want to have a sense of where you are on the big issues of the day. And this is what I'm trying to figure out. Jonathan, did you think the Ontario Liberal Party was distinguishable from the Ontario New Democratic Party in the last Ontario election? Because I know lots of people who didn't.
Well, I think you're exactly right. People give a bit of a smell check. They want to know if you're trustworthy with their tax dollars, if you have the aptitude to deliver on the big challenges, and whether you generally accord with their general view of politics. And I think we didn't so much lose that because of a left-right issue. The center isn't some fixed, static place on the map. It's not Mecca. You have to bring the center to you. And the job of leadership is to inspire people and to convince them that what was once a radical idea, like full-day kindergarten, is now mainstream and is no longer even up for debate. And so that inspirational leadership, that actual work to say, I stand for this and I want you to come along with me, that's what moving to the center means. And we have to do it. And I'll repeat this to say, in a world where millennials are the largest demographic cohort, our issues are different than Gen Z, and they're certainly different than the baby boomers. And so finding that housing affordability versus healthcare for seniors question, and critically, how to pay for it. I think, Steve, you're getting at where Liberals fit between a relatively moderate appearing Conservative Party and, frankly, a relatively moderate appearing NDP. We have to be, dare I say, more ethical and more pragmatic than the Conservatives, but less smug and self-righteous and rigidly ideological than the NDP. There's actually a space there, but you have to define it.
Kate, I see you trying to get in.
The big growth opportunity for us and frankly for every party right now is that 57% of eligible voters didn't vote.
Bingo.
Right? We have lost their faith. They did not think this was relevant enough or important enough or material to their lives to go and do the act of casting a ballot. And so, I really hope that we are keeping our eye on the prize, where in a province where we hit a record, alarm bells going off, kind of low turnout, it is a call to say, okay, people no longer buy that this is doing the things that they need it to do. They have lost faith. And so instead of just, we're talking about moving things around the shelves. People have left the store. So we need to find opportunities to change what they see as political parties and the opportunity that they see engaging in politics can have in terms of making real change that matters to them.
I want to pick up on something Jonathan just said, which is the notion that there were too many, again, I heard this as a criticism from many people last time, there were too many Liberals on the hustings telling people what to think. They were sounding too sanctimonious. They were sounding too arrogant. They were sounding too smug. Dwight, is that a problem this party has yet to figure out how to get out of?
Yes. My friend Jerry Butts says that arrogance is kryptonite for Liberals. And, it is, the party didn't just disappear overnight. We won 3 elections in a row, and but for 1 seat, we almost won 3 majorities in a row.
Yep.
It started, we alienated rural Ontario. Then we alienated, and then we were down to Toronto and Ottawa. And then we alienated Toronto and Ottawa. And so we got to get away from this mushy stuff about telling people or interpreting what do they think's good for them. You got to set an ethical, I think Jonathan used the term, an ethical and moral space that we sit in. And then you got to make the promises add up. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to require a new leader. It's going to require a leader with some real smarts. There's going to be intensive battles. This isn't this is 1,000 small decisions between now and 2025 that don't seem big, but when you add them all up, they are. And here's what I know. I spent half my time in opposition as an MPP. I spent half of it in government. Government is far better than opposition.
You don't say.
Not that opposition's bad or you can't do things, but you can't just listen to people and try to respond. You've got to say, where do I sit? And that's not, with respect, that's not a political science discussion.
Right. Marilyn, let me try this with you. Obviously we have race relations problems in the province of Ontario. Obviously we have problems of misogyny in the province of Ontario. There are plenty of ills out there that we all need to work on. I think it's also fair to say, or at least enough people have told me it's the case, so I think there's a case to be made, that the Liberal Party in some respects got seen by people as being the party that wags its finger at you. You're all a bunch of racists out there. You're all a bunch of misogynists out there. And I wonder if did you hear that at the door? Did you feel that was a problem for your party last time?
No. I think what I heard, and I've come to believe, is that we've taken our voters for granted. We have assumed that we had the right to govern as opposed to earning the right to govern. And I think maybe that's a consequence of having governed for too long and maybe becoming a little too insular. But the reality is our voters, our base, basically wielded their power and let us know that we serve them. And I think what we need to do in terms of kind of identifying some sort of moral or physical or ethical space in which we occupy is going back to the voter. And so I'm going to put on a little bit of a business hat here, if you will. And I think the Ontario Liberals have lost their product market fit, if you will.
You're a banker in real life, so you can make that statement. Okay.
We have lost our product market fit, and mostly because we don't actually know who our market is. We don't actually know who our voter is. I think the Canadian voter, the Ontario voter that used to be Liberal has changed. And I think we haven't done a good job kind of coming back to them and saying, what matters to you? What problems do you need help in solving? What role does government play in that? We've made a ton of assumptions, and I think that it was to our detriment. And that also includes assumptions about certain factions of the community or racialized groups or women or religious groups. And I think we have alienated a lot of people who initially saw themselves as part of the Liberal family. And I do think we need to go back and maybe with our tails between our legs and say, we messed up.
Show a little humility.
A little bit of humility.
Okay.
And recognizing that the party is the members.
I'm going to put a new topic on the agenda here. And actually, Kate, I'm I'm going to let you comment last on it. You're going to have to listen to everybody else first, because you were basically one of the driving forces behind the idea that I'm about to talk to right now, and that is the effort to get the leader of the Green Party, Mike Schreiner, to consider running for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party, which was, you know, an out-of-the-box idea for an unusual time in the party's history. I can certainly see the appeal of it. He's an ethical guy. He's an intelligent guy. He wears his heart on his sleeve. However, and Jonathan, I'll get you to comment first, some people have suggested that the effort to get another leader in the legislature to come to contest the leadership of the Liberal Party demonstrates brand damage, if I can use another one of your banker terms there, brand damage for the Liberal Party, and the suggestion that you don't have any good candidates in the red tent already, therefore you had to go to the green tent to find someone. Discuss, Jonathan.
I mean, I think it's pretty on brand for this party to be too clever by half. We're the party that conceded an election in order to win it in 2018. So I think, listen, Mike Schreiner's a great parliamentarian. He's a good guy. I've always enjoyed working with him for issues like Lake Simcoe. But you have to be a Liberal to lead the Ontario Liberal Party. If he wanted to cross the floor and join the party, I think he could have happily been maybe not a top tier contender, because I don't think could have corralled the support that you need, particularly in ethnic communities, to win a leadership race in this party, but he would have been an interesting voice to have. I think the party needs to be a big tent, but that doesn't mean erasing distinctions. Cooperating and being nonpartisan in how you work to get things done within the legislature doesn't require you to pretend like there aren't differences between parties, there aren't differences between values. Mike Schreiner and I probably agree on 60-70% of things, but there are some core differences between us as well. And so I don't think you gain anything by pretending like all quote unquote progressive parties in a sort of lead now, we have to beat Stephen Harper throwback way. If we just all came together, we could win. Politics doesn't really work that way. It works by winning the argument, not by trying to dilute the differences. So I think it was a well-intended effort, but ultimately we know of at least 3 decent leadership candidates who are putting their names forward, and I hope more will join. But Steve, I don't think you pick someone off waivers to be the team captain. You invest in your team and rebuild it.
I like the sports analogy. Dwight Duncan, your thoughts on the effort to draft Mike?
Well, first of all, I know many of the signatories, and I haven't said anything publicly about my own views. Personally, when I heard it on the news, I thought, well, that's interesting. And I actually did something I don't think too many people did. I went and read the Green Party's platform from the last election and from the election where he was the policy chairman, and frankly, it was flatulence.
Flatulence?
Yeah. It did not, in my view, demonstrate any command of the issues in Ontario, any sensitivity to the needs of people in different regions over different issues. And I thought, and apparently he impressed, you know, the 5 people in Ontario who watched the debate. We talked about it on election night.
As the guy who co-moderated that debate, let me tell you, more than 5 people watched the debate.
But I didn't think, first of all, that it was, if I were part of that, and I wasn't asked to be, I would have gone to him quietly and said, if you join the Liberal Party, then we will come out for you. Because frankly, if I were one, and by the way, I've now spoken with all of our potential leadership candidates. In fact, I just got a text from one of them now, and they're very impressive. Like, I didn't realize, you know, all of their backgrounds. I've met with them, I've talked to them, I said many of the things I've said here.
They've all got good backstories.
They've got really good backstories, and there's nothing very impressive about Schreiner. I get why people went out. By the way, I think this is going to be, I don't think this did any damage to the party in the long run.
Well, that's what I want to pick up on. Marilyn, what do you think? Any long-term brand damage as a result of this effort to get Mike Schreiner to join?
I think, like most folks, I was shocked and awed, and I think the team that drafted might definitely get an A for provocation. I think, I think the very fact that there was a need and conversation about drafting Mike is really about the need for a bold, inspiring leader for the Ontario Liberals. And I don't think that Mike is our guy. I don't think he actually espouses all the views that matter to us. But I do think we have good capable, inspiring talent within the red tent that we should feel we can go to. I think our bench is a little deeper than folks think, and I appreciate and applaud the effort, but I don't think it was kind of the right call for us.
Dwight?
I just want to challenge you on one thing.
Sure.
The two Ontario Liberal leaders who have been Premier, went on to become Premier of Ontario in my lifetime, David Peterson and Dalton McGuinty, were not inspiring, were not bold when they first became leader. They grew in the job. And I've also seen inspired leaders who have gone on to utter humiliation in politics. I think what the party needs is someone like the three who are offering themselves. They may not be well known. If I could offer some advice, I learned when David Peterson first became leader, he had Coke bottle glasses. He was seen as dull. They called Dalton McGuinty wooden, uninspiring. I remember in the leadership that he won, I was part of that race. One columnist said the only way these guys will see the cabinet room is if they get a guided tour of the legislature. Both Peterson and McGuinty grew into the job. And both of them made tough decisions over a number of years.
Of course, you got to get the job first before you can grow into it.
You got to get the job.
Okay, let me get to Kate on this.
May I? I just want to say that I think it's a different time. And I think I think the draft of Mike and the conversation around bringing him was a clear example of poor product market fit. I think it was really a case where you thought you had a good product, but you went back to the market and they kind of responded accordingly.
That's true. Poor Kate, who was one of the drivers behind this, has been sitting there patiently listening to everybody else weigh in about this. Let me just set this up, Kate, before handing you the floor by saying, you know, it was not just you. It was Greg Sorbera, who's a former finance minister, Deb Matthews, a former deputy premier as well, Lynn McLeod, a former leader. You had a lot of heavy hitters on that list of people who wanted to try to get Mike Schreiner to consider running for the Liberal leadership. Ultimately, he decided to stay put. The question is whether you think it's done any long-term brand damage to the Liberals.
I think the basic motivation remains. So too many people have decided either they're not voting or they're not voting for us. And to be able to not just run the same election a third time, we need to do something that shows people that we are different, that we have learned. I hope that includes things like being open and not this like be a liberal. You know, that's like 2% of the population if we're just referring to members. We need to be open, we need to be engaging. And a leadership race is perfectly positioned to do exactly that. You know, we have three, probably more, fabulous, wonderful people who are running, who are doing the work of talking to people across the province. I hope we see a big, exciting race. And I do hope that we are very open to learning from people who, outside of the Liberal movement, have had some success. The Greens have a very grassroots party. They've been able to do a lot with a little. There's a lot of things I think we can learn from them. I feel like I've said this a million times, but it's not a leader race, it's a leadership race. It's about the opportunity for a big group of people to move us in one direction, a direction that is exciting and motivating and demonstrates that we're different. And I feel very hopeful about what's possible. And I know many of the signatories on the letter would feel the same. We have to show people that we are different than before. You know, this was one idea. I'm sure there are many other good ideas that will come, including from the slate of candidates who are already stepping forward. But we have to show people that we are different. Otherwise, I fear that we will fall back into the same trap and just see a third rerun, and I'm personally not interested in that. Okay, just a few minutes to go here, and since we've mentioned the fact that there are three candidates that we know of running at this stage of the game, I should mention their names. There are two members of Parliament currently, Nate Erskine-Smith and Yasser Naqvi, and there's one member of the Ontario Legislature, Ted Hsu, who actually is a former member of Parliament, and I think Stephanie Bowman is kicking the tires as well. She's a rookie MPP from Don Valley West, Kathleen Wynne's own riding. Okay, a few minutes to go. Let's try this. If we go back, Jonathan, to 2003, Dalton McGuinty won that election with 2 million votes. And if we go back to the last election, Stephen Del Duca led the Liberals to 1.1 million votes. Now, obviously, a lot of Liberals stayed home and a lot of non-aligned people stay home. I'd like to know, you know, as you guys gather in Hamilton this weekend, I'd like to know what's one idea that you could put out there that would get those 900,000 people who disappeared on you over the intervening 20 years to come back?
I think Dwight Duncan said it. It's not about one decision. It's about 1,000 little decisions that level up to a win. And so I'm going to slightly reject the premise of your question, Steve, to say that we need to get everything right. We need to do grassroots organizing in a world where people are bowling alone and they're doing it online in their own information ecosystem. We need to actually have a clear policy platform that I think picks up on 3 or 4 or 5 big themes and draws a contrast. Part of what the problem with the last election was coming from the Ford Tories grabbing the initiative and saying, we're going to get it done, whatever it is, whatever was popular locally. And Stephen Del Duca and Andrea Horwath had a bit of a grab bag to talk about a little bit of everything. I think we see voter turnout go up when there's a clear difference, when there's actually a clash, when there's a debate that you want to engage in because you want to be heard on your say. I think when it comes to leadership, generational change and a sense of someone who knows how to communicate digitally and who knows how to say, what does it actually mean to be a progressive and a liberal today? It typically means a general indifference to social issues, but still in a positive way, but still a sense of economic fairness and the ability to create a stronger economy. So I think we have to get all of these things right. And in 2011, the Federal Party was at the equivalent stage of where we are now. 2 devastating defeats in a row. The first one, arguably not as bad as the second one, because at least we saw the first one coming. That is a wake-up call. And it's both symbolism and substance to reform the party. And so the weighted one-member, one-vote debate, some of the accountability mechanisms, the Northern and Rural Caucus idea, it sends a terrible message if we essentially do the same thing this coming weekend and expect a different result.
I'm glad you summed everything up so well there, because we're plumb out of time now. So I have time left to thank Dwight Duncan, the former Deputy Premier and Minister of Finance for the province of Ontario, the 2 candidates, Kate Graham and Marilyn Raphael from the last Ontario election, and Jonathan Scott, who is hanging out down there in Florida right now, which is where we all ought to be. It's great to have you 4 on TVO tonight, and enjoy yourselves at the convention this weekend if you're going. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's the nature of politics that allegations get thrown around and people question the behavior of their opponents. But once those accusations reach a certain threshold, ideally someone investigates to determine if a real violation has occurred, and if so, does something about it. Enter integrity commissioners, for instance. Does it actually work that way? Let's ask Ian Stedman, assistant professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at York University, who previously worked in the Office of the Integrity Commissioner of Ontario, and Duff Conacher, co-founder of the advocacy group Democracy Watch. Welcome to you both in the studio. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so in the last 30 years or so, we've seen integrity offices appear at all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal. Recently, we've seen politicians at all levels have to answer to them. Most recently, we can talk about Prime Minister Trudeau's ministers, Premier Ford Stag-and-Doe, and the former Toronto Mayor John Tory's relationship with a staffer. Broadly speaking, Duff, I'll start with you. Why is it important that these ethic commissioners exist?
Well, it used to be that the Prime Minister, the Premier, or municipal politicians in the council would essentially decide themselves whether they had violated the rules. And no matter how clear the evidence was, there wouldn't be a clear finding. They would often just deny it and deny it. And so at least we now have a chance with these commissioners. They have several flaws, but we have a chance with these commissioners that there's an independent investigation, more independent than politicians investigating themselves, and a chance to have people found guilty. And that's what's happened since these commissioners have been created.
Ian.
Yeah, absolutely. Before the commissioners, we had party politics, and the committees might be involved in figuring out whether someone had transgressed the ethics rules. And if you had a majority government, for example, your committee might actually be stacked in favor of the person who has the allegation against them. And so there's a skepticism that would emerge from that, from the public, for example, to say, that's not an independent investigation. Do we really trust the results of it? And as Duff was saying, sometimes stuff just didn't happen. There was no accountability. And so these independent offices give us a chance to at least have an opportunity for accountability.
All right, Duff, you've called ethic watchdogs weak lapdogs, SARs that do whatever they want. Why do you feel such harsh language is necessary?
Well, they have some very serious flaws. They're not actually independent. They're chosen by the politicians who they watch over, often by the ruling party cabinet. through a secretive process in a lot of jurisdictions. Secondly, they lack enforcement powers. And often they can't investigate unless there is a complaint filed, so they can't initiate something themselves. Third, they lack the power to penalize. And so politicians trust them to judge whether a violation has occurred, but have not trusted them across Canada to actually impose a penalty. And fourth, they're unaccountable to the public in many serious ways. They can issue secret rulings. They're not required to issue a public ruling in every case. Members of the public have no right to force an investigation by filing a complaint. It's a kind of a closed club where only politicians can complain about each other, and that taints the whole process with partisanship. And finally, because the public doesn't have these rights, if they fail to do their jobs, if they ignore the facts, ignore the law, you can't take them to court and challenge it in court in a lot of cases. So these flaws of lack of independence, lack of enforcement powers, penalty powers, and lack of accountability to the public really are fatal flaws in a lot of cases.
With that being said, Ian, you have said ethics commissioners see themselves playing more of an advisory role than an adversarial role. You know, some actual commissioners are actually uncomfortable with conducting investigations into politicians. Seems counterintuitive, no?
Well, I think for commissioners, what they would rather do is give advice to help members avoid conflicts. And so they see that as their primary function. And I can speak from my experience being on the inside for 5 years working with commissioners. They really do care about helping members avoid issues. They would much rather you came to them beforehand and avoided all the problems. But, you know, when they have to, they conduct investigations. But to Duff's point, they don't really have teeth. And that's, I think, sometimes it's a fault of how they administer their regimes, but most of the time, from my perspective, it's a fault of the regimes they're given to administer, and they're just not robust enough.
How does that look from the inside? When you talk about preventative, is it an MP or an MPP is coming and reaching out to you? What does that conversation look like before it's obviously too late?
Ideally, an MPP or someone in their office, an advisor, for example, will reach out and say, the MPP is going to do this or has been invited to do this thing down the road. Given this context, is it the right thing to do? Should we say yes or should we say no? You know, the nature of politics, however, is sometimes things move too fast, and an MPP or an MP will make a decision without reaching out to the Integrity Commissioner. And sometimes we see that they actually have advisors within the caucus that they go to first because they're really not sure and they don't want to alert an ethics commissioner to what's going on. And so that's problematic too.
Very interesting. All right, Duff, you talked about penalties. I want to talk about some of them. What's the biggest penalty an ethics watchdog in this country can deliver against a politician who is found that they've behaved unethically?
Yeah, if I could just mention one thing, that there's an overall key flaw that everyone should remember, which is that the rules they're enforcing are often loophole-filled. I mean, it's actually legal for cabinet ministers across the country and any other politician to have a secret investment and to make decisions that will profit themselves and their family members. So it's a huge, huge loophole in the rules where really a lot of these laws do not apply to 99% of what the politicians do. For 1% that they do apply to, the harshest penalty is at the federal level. It's only $500 fine, and that's for just filing an inaccurate statement of your financial assets and liabilities or failing to file it on time. And that's the maximum that can be filed. Otherwise, across the country, as Ian was mentioning, the watchdogs are lapdogs in that they can only bark. They can't bite. They can't impose penalties. They can recommend them. But then that recommendation goes back to the legislature, and politicians decide whether to penalize one of their own. And again, as Ian was mentioning, in a majority government situation, if you're from that ruling party, they're likely not going to penalize you. If in a minority government situation, they might penalize you. I mean, that's a kangaroo court process where politicians are judging each other. So again, if ethics commissioners can be trusted to investigate and rule on situations, politicians should also be trusting them to impose penalties. And the penalties should be very high because the laws that they're enforcing, and all these flaws apply to also the transparency laws, the spending laws, the lobbying laws. All the watchdogs have these same flaws. The laws that they are enforcing are second only to the criminal code anti-bribery provisions in terms of protecting our democracy and protecting good government. So the penalties for violating them should be very high, not just a maximum $500 fine or a recommendation to a legislature.
With that, obviously $500 doesn't seem like a lot of money. Then on the other end, should we be looking at potentially suspending or expelling members of office?
So I think one thing that Duff and I agree on quite regularly is that we don't have strong enough punishments, or at least deterrents. And often ethics commissioners will file a report where they are more forgiving than they are, absconding or giving direct feedback. They've an error made in good faith. And I think it's time now. We've had these laws for quite some time. In fact, Commissioner Mario Dion, who just stepped down, said on his way out, great quote, "My God, these laws have been in place for like 17 years." It's time that we stop being forgiving and we start holding our elected officials accountable for actually learning the laws before they take office or as they're taking office, and hold them to I think, higher standards, as Duff is pointing out.
In terms of the $500, you've equated that to a parking fine. In terms of at the end of the day, when we talk about the public, they've paid tickets that are higher than this, and $100 max $500 is a slap on the wrist. What does that say when we look at the fines there?
Yeah, a lot of the commissioners across the country say, I can't investigate anything unless I get a complaint from a politician. And they ignore, I think, a general power they have to be doing audits, to be looking more closely at government information and whether there's things happening that are violations of the rules. But because they mostly take that attitude, the media has caught most people. And then, again, this is a maximum fine, and it's not even for violating the ethics rules. It's just for violating the filing rules of your disclosures. And so really, across Canada, if you park illegally anywhere, you have a higher chance of getting caught because there's the people running around checking the meters, and you will pay a higher fine. And that's perverse. I mean, parking illegally usually doesn't cause any problem unless you happen to park in front of a hydrant and there is a fire. But violating these rules undermine our democracy, lead to abuse, protection of the private interests, big businesses, abuses of communities, and again, are second only to the criminal code anti-bribery provisions. So the penalties should be very high, and the chance of getting caught should be very high as well, because it's key to protecting our democracy.
Is being caught by the electorate ultimately the biggest sanction?
It is. Shaming is the really only sanction out there, and unfortunately what we've seen recently is that the shame level has gone down, and politicians used to resign when these things came out, even though there wasn't a finding, if the evidence was clear. Now they're just not resigning at all and just rolling along and hoping the media turns its attention to something else a couple weeks later.
Very interesting. All right, you talked about Federal Ethics Commissioner Mario Dion, of course, stepped down because of health issues. Curious here, who is usually in charge of appointing ethics commissioners in the first place, and is there a concern there?
So as Duff was mentioning earlier, it's different depending on the jurisdiction. At the federal level, though, the cabinet chooses someone and then consults with the leaders of the other parties.
What do you mean, but what's the air quotes then?
There's no need for anyone to consent. It's just a very vague consults with, and then they make a recommendation for an appointment. So at the federal level, it's actually, as Duff was saying, a very secretive, kind of not very transparent process. And it's been criticized quite widely. In fact, I think you sought judicial review over.
Yeah, the Federal Court of Appeal ruled in the case we brought challenging the appointments of the Ethics Commissioner and Lobbying Commissioner that the Cabinet is biased when making these appointments. Of course they are. You can't choose your own judge or your own watchdog, but they do in every area, not just ethics, but lobbying, transparency, spending, and it's a fatal flaw. And BC has an all-party committee choose these people. That's better, but it's still politicians choosing their own watchdog. It really should be an independent commission that does a search for a qualified short list of candidates, and then politicians could make the final choice.
Jeff, are ethics commissioners obligated to investigate complaints brought forward by other politicians or by the public?
Across Canada, pretty much only by politicians. And so that's a closed club. The public employs all these people, including the Integrity Commissioner. We pay for all of them, and yet as the boss, we can't file a complaint against our employees. And it's just, again, politicians have designed these positions to really be weak lapdogs instead of strong watchdogs. And pretty much all the parties want to keep it that way.
And I imagine the answer is pretty obvious here, is that they get to also pick and choose what they get to investigate as well.
In a lot of cases as well, politicians can force investigations and rulings, but members of the public can. And it's just crazy in a democracy to shut out the public from this key accountability process.
So an interesting nuance there too is in Ontario, for example, the Integrity Commissioner can't choose to investigate something unless it's come to their office via a complaint from an MPP, from the cabinet, or a motion from the floor. Federally, there's something called an own initiative investigation right. So they would have the right to investigate something that they became aware of, but they're not forced to, as Duff noted.
Okay. Ian, you've made the argument that in the past few decades, we've witnessed integrity in public office, a culture of accountability erode into compliance culture. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I think what we saw, a great example would have been when Justin Trudeau was first, with the Aga Khan.
2016.
Every time the journalist asked, what's happening, and he said, I am going to comply with the commissioner's investigation, as though compliance itself was, the standard of integrity, right? So as Duff was noting, they create the rules so that they're easy to comply with, but they don't actually hold them to the highest standards that we, as the public, now looking in, would want them to be held to. So to say I'm complying isn't the same as saying I'm acting ethically. It's merely I'm complying. And so it's from my perspective, it is obfuscate. It's stepping aside. It's sidestepping the question and just saying, no, don't worry about it. Don't worry. The rules are there, and I'm going to follow the rules. But if the rules are not good, then following them really doesn't help, public trust in our democracy.
With that being said, of course, Prime Minister Trudeau has been found to have breached ethical rules a few times. And I'm curious, what standard has that set for his caucus and his party when they look at their leader, does this, apologizes a few times, and then does that open the gates?
At the federal level, when an investigation is conducted under the Act, the commissioner reports back to the Prime Minister, and it is on the Prime Minister to determine what happens after. Is there a punishment? What's the accountability mechanism? So when it's the Prime Minister getting a report about his own violations and he apologizes, it's not even a pretend slap on the wrist, right? It just disappears. And I've taken the position, or at least said recently, that I think that's the reason we're seeing more and more violations in his caucus, is because he hasn't really taken accountability for those transgressions. And so his caucus hasn't kicked him out of the leadership either. So they haven't forced him to held him to account. And so when they violate, again, nothing happens. Recently, Mary Ng with the two very blatant, very unacceptable violations. Nothing came from it.
What did she do for our viewers?
She gave contracts to friends, sole sourced, multiple tens of thousands of dollars that she should have been screened from having anything to do with.
All right.
Yeah.
Duff, I want to get your take on Ian's thesis here. Do Canadian politicians hold each other to a higher standard decades ago, or has that changed?
What's changed is that they used to resign. And there wasn't a watchdog, but the media would find out about things, or opposition parties. If the evidence was clear, they would often resign. And now they're just not resigning. Are things worse now in terms of compliance levels? It's very difficult to tell. It's really apples and oranges. You can't tell because of the secrecy level. People don't say, hey, I'm doing this bad thing publicly. They do it in secret. The watchdogs didn't exist in the past. 20 cabinet ministers under Jean Chrétien violated the rules, but there was no one to find them guilty, and so they didn't resign either in a lot of those cases. So overall, as Ian was mentioning, what is unethical across the board, and any member of the public would say it's unethical, is legal across the board in Canada because of the weaknesses and loopholes in the ethics rules. And so politicians are just holding themselves to that very weak standard, and then again, not resigning now like they used to. And so it is worse in that way, definitely.
Obviously, the most recent news of John Tory resigning, is that an anomaly in terms of what we've been seeing?
Very unusual, very, very unusual. Out of the 20 with Chrétien that violated the rules, and there was lots of evidence and media coverage, only 2 were resigned by the Prime Minister. And then it's just even downgraded even more than that, and now almost no one resigns.
Duff, is it more so that politicians are intentionally trying to skirt the rules in a sort of corrupt way, or are they mistakenly breaking these laws, or maybe not paying attention or not having those meetings with commissioners beforehand?
Yeah, we were talking about Mario Dion, who just resigned as federal ethics commissioner, and one of the things he said was mandatory training should be required by all the cabinet ministers. He expressed shock, as Ian mentioned, that they don't know these rules, that they're not taking the time to learn them themselves. And in that way, they're intentionally breaking them because they're not learning them. But a lot of them are mistakes. And then there are intentional things that are done as well, very clearly. And so, if you look at any system like jaywalking, it's illegal. Why do people do it? Because a police car would pass you by while you're jaywalking and not stop you. And of course, you wouldn't pay any penalty as a result. It's the same with ethics rules with politicians and public officials across the board, across Canada. They just are not stopped and there's no penalties. So why do they pay attention? Why would they?
Ian, let's talk solutions. How can we improve training so that our elected officials behave more ethically?
So in Ontario, for example, it's mandatory that within 30 days of taking office, you meet with the Integrity Commissioner to discuss your filing, which is your assets, your liabilities, your interests. And then there's like an hour-long training session where they talk to you about what your obligations are and what the Act does. A professor at York University, my mentor Ian Green, wrote 20 years ago that the federal regime needs to do the same thing, that they need to force the regulatees, the people subject to the laws, to come in and actually learn about the laws and the rules as they're taking office. And then in Ontario, it's every year as well. You have to come in and meet. So there's something there. The challenge at the federal level is that there's just so many people who are subject to the rules that you would really have to ramp up the resourcing of the office.
I'll stick with you, Ian. Ethics commissioners are kind of like catch-22, right? In that people in charge are the ones who are actually creating these commissions, and are the people the commissioners have to see. Explain that to me a little bit, because you talked that off the top, that we're in an awkward spot here, right? As this was made as sort of to be accountable, but at the end of the day, this is being created by people to oversee themselves.
It is, ironically enough, the inherent conflict of interest laws is that the parliamentarians themselves are the ones who create the laws and then are subject to them. So we may sit here and say, make life harder on yourself, make the laws more strict, but unless we all get off our couches and go to the polls and make ethics one of those issues that matters to us, there's really no incentive because there's no political capital to be gained for them. And that's why we see some things just disappear and no improvements get made. It's really on the people, as you noted earlier, to say we care about the ethics of our politicians, and that's going to be a voting issue for us. So tell us what you're going to do. In the last federal election, despite Justin Trudeau having been found on the wrong side of the ethics laws several times, the opposition said nothing. It was not
Normally
what
this
they
would
hammered
be political, you keep this in the back pocket for our next election and you throw it back at them.
Yeah.
Does it have the same weight?
Across the board, the parties want power without accountability. So they'll play gotcha politics and complain and point out scandals and try and highlight them with committee hearings. But do they want the rules changed? I mean, it's very clear not. The House committee at the federal level just reviewed the MPs' ethics rules and actually recommended weakening them. They did so in the last time they reviewed them as well. The Commissioner of Lobbying is currently proposing to gut the rules that will, in ways that will allow lobbyists to fundraise for politicians and campaign for them at the same time as lobbying them. And you're not seeing any party or politicians speak out about that. So they're quite happy to, unfortunately, have weak rules, weak enforcement systems, choose their own lapdogs, and keep the penalties very low because it suits them if they ever win power.
With that being said, Def, what would ethic commissioners' offices have to look like for them to be completely independent?
An independent appointment system where you have a search committee that is not connected to any party, and they come up with a short list of qualified people. The politicians could make the final choice, but they shouldn't be controlling the whole process. Enforcement powers, including if anyone files a complaint from the public, you have to rule on it. You have to rule on make all your rulings public so that people know whether you're doing your job properly. High penalties, high fines that would really discourage violations. And a right for anyone to challenge a ruling in court if it ignores the facts or ignores the law. And if we had that, we would have strong watchdogs instead of these weak lapdogs.
Ian, finally, don't want to put the spotlight here on you, but give us some examples of some politicians that you think have gotten away with some some violations.
Oh, I'd hesitate to do that. I do think it's going to be interesting to see what the investigation into Premier Ford and his daughter's backyard party. I think there's a lot of information we don't have yet about that. And so I would love to come back and talk about that one when we have more information, because I think that will be one where we see potentially some very intentional, or at least deliberate, skirting of the rules or using of the loopholes. It just looks too, it's too convenient to me that it wasn't, thought out in advance. So that one I think will be interesting.
Jeff?
Well, Democracy Watch is challenging the Ontario Integrity Commissioner for letting a bunch of lobbyists off the hook with their relationship with politicians right now in court. We're challenging the Federal Ethics Commissioner in court for letting Trudeau off on the We Charity grant. We're challenging the Commissioner of Lobbying in court because a couple of lobbyists helped a minister get elected and then lobbied the minister's department. The biggest example, though, from the past, though, I think, which shows the loophole in the law, is Bill Morneau when he was finance minister. His family company is a pension management company. He introduced a bill to make, which would have made more money for his family's company. And the commissioner, it was reported in the headlines, no conflict of interest, Commissioner finds. It actually was a conflict of interest. Of course it was. He owned $30 million worth of shares in the family company, introduced a bill that would make more money for the company. But the law did not apply because you're allowed to do that under the federal laws. You're allowed to introduce bills that apply to an industry while having investments in that industry and profit from the changes that the bill makes. That is a loophole that exists across the country, and cabinet ministers are allowed to profit from their own decisions. So getting away with that was the biggest thing I've seen due to a loophole in the law, not because of the commissioner. The commissioner couldn't do anything. It was legal.
Thank you so much for joining us on the program. I've learned a lot. I know our viewers have as well, and we will definitely invite you guys back on the show because I'm sure there will be a number more violations in the years to come.
Unfortunately.
So something to look
Hopefully
for.
not, but probably yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, March the 2nd, 2023. Tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka examines the efficacy of another watchdog, Ontario's Special Investigations Unit, in light of 2 police-involved shootings this week in the province. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.